Welcome back to the Architect Fitness video series on nutrition. My name is Tony. If you haven't watched the first two videos yet, I highly recommend you do so, as you'll probably find this video a lot more useful if you do. In the first video, we talked about the basics of nutrition, including an introduction to flexible dieting. And in the second video, we talked about tracking your food, specifically in the app MyFitnessPal. Now in this video, we're going to teach you how to put it all together in the real world, and we're going to go over some examples of foods and what macros are in different types of foods. So we're going to jump right into it and start with protein, since that's the most important macro and probably the one people have the most difficult time hitting for their goal each day. And I really want to emphasize this as we go through the video. There's never going to be a time where we can tell you, hey, just eat this or that. You're going to have to go through the learning curve of learning what's in your food and building a better relationship with your food. But the good news is, in the long run, it's going to empower you to have much more control over your nutrition and over your body. Now, before we start going over these protein examples, I want to mention there are very few single macro foods. That means almost all food has a combination of proteins, carbs, and fats to some degree. When we say a good source of protein or a good source of carbs or a good source of fat, what we mean is that food has an abundance of that particular macro. It doesn't mean that that food does not have the other macros in it. So let's jump right into this. Probably the single best source of protein for most people is chicken. Now I have two examples for you right here. I have shredded rotisserie chicken. We get this at Shaw's Supermarket. I like this because it's fast, it tastes good, it's already ready to go. I can just weigh it out and eat it. It tastes good cold, it tastes good reheated, it tastes really good in a burrito or a quesadilla or in a salad. So this is super handy. While some people are looking for other options aside from chicken on how to get their protein, chicken is super versatile. You can cook it a billion different ways, and it is a really good protein-packed food because when you take the skin off of it and we're eating mostly breast meat, it's very low in fat, basically non-existent for the carbs, and has about 7 grams of protein per ounce of food. So if you eat 1 ounce of chicken, you'll have got 7 grams of protein. Most people are going to be eating somewhere between 4 to 6 ounces. So you're going to have 30 to maybe even 50 grams of protein per serving. So this is a great way to get more protein in. Now let's talk about a little bit more of the traditional route, which is raw chicken breast. I have these marinated in barbecue sauce, which are going to add a little bit more carb macros, not much. The sauce we're using is G. Hughes, which is very low calorie, low carb. I think there's only about 2 grams of carbs per serving, and we use probably about 3 or 4 servings in this bag, and we'll let these marinate for a day or two, and then we'll cook them up to add some really nice flavor. But again, chicken is probably one of the biggest sources of protein in my particular diet and most people who are following a macro-based diet. All right, let's put the chicken aside for a moment. Let's talk about another really good source of protein that has minimal macros as far as carbs and fats are concerned, and that is protein powder. I have here the Transparent Labs Whey Protein Isolate Milk Chocolate flavor. This has no fat, 2 carbs, and 28 grams of protein per serving, so that's great. Of course, the macros are going to vary quite a bit depending on the brand and how the protein is made, but most whey protein isolates are going to be predominantly protein with very much in the way of other macros as far as fats and carbs are concerned. Now, some people have hesitations about using protein powder because it's a supplement and they're told that they should get all their food from whole foods. But basically, whey protein is really no different to your body than eating a chicken breast or any other protein source. Liquids digest a little bit faster than whole foods or solid foods, and that can be an advantage, the faster digestion time. And also, whey protein also just absorbs really quickly, so it's ideal for after a workout or anytime you just need to get in some extra protein really quick, because you can bring protein with you. You don't necessarily have to refrigerate it or anything like that. So it's very, very convenient. I wouldn't suggest that someone tries to get all their protein from protein shakes, but 1 to 2 shakes a day even is not that big of a deal. So if you struggle to get your protein in, definitely consider getting something like a whey protein isolate. All right, next let's talk about some foods that are high in protein, but also high in other macros. And we're going to start with some grass-fed beef. And the beef that we usually get is 93.7. So 93% lean, 7% fat. That means of the total weight of this package, 7% of that weight is coming from fat. So one serving, which is 4 ounces, has 8 grams of fat, 0 grams of carbs, but 23 grams of protein. So another really good source of protein, but of course you do have the fats in there. So again, try not to think of foods as just protein or just carbs or just fats. Most foods are going to have a blend of all 3 macros, or at the very least a blend of 2 of the macros, which brings me to my next item, which is eggs. Now, everyone thinks eggs are a great source of protein, and they are, but they're also very high in fat. In fact, the ratio of protein to fat is not even as good as that grass-fed beef I just showed you. So there's a way you can reduce the amount of fat in eggs, and that is to only eat the egg whites, because the yolk is the part that contains most of the fat, and the white is the part that contains most of the protein. Obviously, they don't taste as good, and of course, it is a little bit wasteful if you're using whole eggs and only cooking the whites and then just throwing the yolks away. Of course, you can get egg whites that are in a container, so they're already pre-separated. That's up to you. I'm personally not a fan of it, but I know a lot of people that are on macro diets that do follow that strategy. All right, we already talked about beef and eggs. Now let's talk about another really good protein source, but that does have some other macros in it, and that is sea scallops. Now these are frozen. Of course, you can get them fresh, but the macros on them are pretty good. Only 1 gram of fat, 6 grams of carbs, and 18 grams of protein per serving, which is 4 ounces. And these macros are pretty typical for any white fish or white seafood. If you start eating something like salmon, you're going to see that fat content a little bit higher, although the protein content is still very good. Where beef and chicken is about 7 grams per ounce of weight, seafood tends to be higher. It's usually about 9 grams per ounce. So the protein content does improve with some seafoods, although it varies on fish to fish and seafood to seafood. Now, you'll probably agree with me that carbs are the most fun food. And carbs are a food that, although there's lots of foods that have also proteins and fats in them, you can find a lot of foods that are purely carbohydrate. Contrary to popular belief, carbs are good for you, they are important, and I'm not going to get into that too much as we already discussed that a little bit in the first video of this series. So let's talk about one of my favorite sources of carbohydrates, and that would be maple syrup. There is absolutely nothing else other than carbohydrates in maple syrup, and of course it makes everything taste delicious, but this probably isn't going to be too much of use for you unless you're at the end of the day and all you have left to eat is carbohydrates. So you're probably not going to just eat straight up maple syrup, so let's put that aside for a second. One of my other most favorite sources of carbohydrates is bagels. I usually eat Thomas plain bagels, and why I love them is there's about 52 grams of carbs in one of these bagels, but there are also 10 grams of protein, which is awesome. So when I get to the end of the day and I have a little bit of protein, carbs, and fats left, I love to have a bagel with some butter on it because it's got all 3 of the macros. Next, let's talk about fruit. As you guys probably know, fruit is mostly carbohydrates, although some fruits like strawberries also have fat in them. I like to eat something like blackberries or raspberries because for the amount of food you get as far as weight and size and volume, you can eat a lot, but the calorie count isn't super high, and they're also loaded with fiber. Some of my other favorite fruits are things like clementines, grapes, black grapes, red grapes. Now, lately, people have been loving to hate on sugar, saying you should absolutely avoid it. You're going to have a very difficult time doing that because almost all fruit is sugar, and also any other carbohydrate that you eat gets turned into sugar once your body digests it. Your brain runs on glucose, and if you don't eat any sugar or carbohydrates, your brain will make its own sugar via a process called gluconeogenesis, where it will actually take proteins that you eat and from your muscle tissue and turn them into sugars in your liver. So I promise you, you don't have to fear sugar. One of the reasons why people try to limit it or should limit it is because it does add a lot of extra calories to your foods if you're eating a lot of foods with added sugars in them, and they don't really do a whole lot to satisfy you or make you feel full. So if you eat a very calorie dense food and those calories come from sugar, you're probably going to be feeling hungry and craving something else very shortly thereafter. But there's nothing inherently dangerous or bad about sugars themselves, only that they're extremely easy to overconsume. Now, there's a ton of other foods that fall under the carbohydrate category, from breads and vegetables and all different things, but here's just a brief overview of things that I like to eat and where I'm getting a lot of my carbs from. Last, we're going to talk about fats. Fats are probably the worst macronutrient to have left at the end of the day if you don't have any proteins or carbs left over, because there are so few foods that have only fat in them. Pretty much it's just oils. So things like olive oil, coconut oil, those are great sources of fat, but if you have to eat them by themselves, it's going to be pretty gross. Butter is another great source of fat, and of course there's nothing else aside from fat in butter. And let's talk about a food that sometimes people categorize as a protein, sometimes people categorize it as a fat, but it really has all three macronutrients in it, and quite a large amount as well, and that is peanut butter. So in one serving, which is 2 tablespoons, there are 16 grams of fat, which is a considerable amount. That's actually more than a single tablespoon of butter. There's also 7 grams of carbs and 8 grams of protein. So I probably would file peanut butter under a fat just because it has more fat in it than it does proteins and carbs, but this is a food that has all three macros in it. Now, when we're talking about foods that are good sources of fat but might also have other macronutrients in it, we already talked about beef and eggs, which have a lot of fat but also a lot of protein. And of course, the scallops didn't have much in the way of fat, but if you looked at a fish like a salmon or a non-white fish, you're going to see a lot more fat content to go along with that protein. This is just scratching the surface on what is in different types of foods. There are so many foods out there, so many food combinations. That's why if someone just tells you what to eat for breakfast, tells you what to eat for lunch and for dinner, you're never going to really learn anything, and you're never going to take control of your own results. Tracking your macros is so powerful because as you are putting these foods into your food journal or your food diary, you are seeing what it has in it for calories, what it has in it for proteins, carbs, and fats. And you are learning all about the foods that you're eating and the things that you're putting in your body. And after a while, you start to know, okay, I have 30 grams of protein left for the day. That's going to be 3 or 4 ounces of chicken. And not only that, but you'll know what 3 or 4 ounces of chicken looks like, even though you might still be weighing the food. You learn more about what portion sizes look like and how much food you roughly need to eat at any given meal or on any given day. Another great feature of MyFitnessPal is the ability to add friends just like you would on Facebook and other social media platforms. And if they have their privacy settings to friends, you can actually look at their food diary and you can see what they're eating. So if you're curious about that, you can add me on MyFitnessPal. My MyFitnessPal name is Coach Tony P, and you can get an idea for some of the things that I like to eat. Keep in mind, different people have different macronutrient targets. Macros are based on your age, height, weight, gender, activity level, and to some degree personal preference. For clients that prefer saltier foods, we tend to prescribe higher fat macros. If clients like sweeter things or crave more carb dense foods, we tend to give them higher carb targets and take a little bit less for the fats. So it really just depends on the person. So you can't just look at somebody and say, I love their physique or I love their performance and I want to just eat like them, because it's an extremely individual thing. And that's another reason why telling people exactly what to eat never really works. My palate and your palate might be completely different. So there's no way that I can know all the little nuances of your particular taste and what you like to eat and program them in a sensible way. There's an infinite amount of combinations and you just have to find what works for you. But the only way you're going to get there is if you start tracking your food and learning what's in your food so you can take control of your nutrition and your results. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any questions, please post them into the comments section below or shoot me an email, tony@architectfitness.com. And look out for the next video in this series where we're going to follow around Coach Katie, and she's going to take you through an entire day of what she eats and about how many macros are in each of her meals. So that'll give you another real world example of how people are taking the flexible dieting strategy and applying it to a real world situation. See you guys next time.